Welcome back to our 5 Things video series. Really excited to be with you again. This is our final installment. As you will remember, we've been talking about offshore investing and everything offshore investing. In our last video, we spoke about all of the different complex terminology and jargon that you would get, potentially you'd hear or get familiar with as you hear people talk about offshore investing. And we help demystify a lot of the perceptions out there and help simplify some of the jargon and terminology that you might hear. We also spoke a little bit about how you access offshore, and we skimmed the surface on tax. Today, we're going to talk about tax and what it means and what the implications are for investors. In studio, we've got Brandon. Brandon, welcome and thank you for joining us again. Brandon is a lead specialist in the investment proposition space, and today is going to unpack a little bit more about tax. So Brandon, it's quite a minefield. Every investor is unique. They have unique consequences from a tax perspective. Take us through some of that and what we would need to consider from a tax perspective.
Yeah, I think that word unique is probably a great starting point. So as you rightfully mentioned, people have their unique circumstances in terms of family dynamics, in terms of where on the tax table they sit, in terms of where they'd want these funds to eventually go, in terms of beneficiaries. So all of those considerations are really important when it comes to tax. There's a few other implications that's quite important in terms of what actual investment vehicle you end up investing through. So is that an investment account, or colloquially we say, is that via a unit trust, or is it via a wrap solution like an endowment? So all of those considerations would need to be factored in when we think about your holistic position in terms of tax.
So let's just dig a little bit deeper into that. You're speaking about unit trusts, you're speaking about endowments. Let's start with unit trusts, or as most people will know it, as investment accounts. What are the implications there?
So I'm going to talk about a natural person owning a so-called offshore unit trust, right?
Yes.
So there would be foreign interest being earned. So foreign interest would be earned, that would need to be declared. Foreign dividends would be earned, and that would need to be declared. And of course, there's a host of withholding taxes that's involved with foreign dividends. With foreign interest, there's exemptions that could apply. So that talks about the funds coming in, right? So foreign interest, foreign dividends, yes. Capital gains as well. And capital gains would have implications based on where on the tax table you sit. So anything up to 45% times your inclusion rate of 40 would take you up to an 18% on capital gains. But based on the unique nature, that capital gains tax that you pay is going to be dependent on where you fall in the tax table. The dividends withholding tax that you pay will depend on the jurisdiction you're receiving the dividends from, because they would have different withholding taxes.
That's great. So if I understand you, the individual investor would be liable for any growth that they get in a offshore unit trust, and they would have to declare that both from a capital perspective as well as an income or interest perspective. Great. We often hear about endowments. Sometimes we hear a lot of financial advisors coining the term life-wrapped solutions. It sounds complex. Take us through what the tax implications are there and a little bit about what an endowment is.
Sure. It may sound complex, but it's actually quite a simple solution. And I think after I talk to you about this, I think we'll have a better appreciation for what an endowment offers. So as you mentioned, often called a life wrapper, because a life company is involved in terms of licensing agreements and in terms of ownership. So within an endowment, specifically in terms of tax, you have up to 30% applied on your income tax and up to 12% being applied for capital gains. Now, loosely we say this is the 5-fund taxation approach. And I'm not going to go into details of what each of the 5 funds are, but when we talk about the 5-fund taxation approach, or up to 30% income tax, up to 12% CGT, essentially the company, in our case Liberty, is paying over tax on the client's behalf on those rates that I mentioned. So if you're a client that's a high net worth client, being taxed at the maximum or your marginal tax rate of 45%, paying 45% on income and 18% on CGT, suddenly you've got a solution where you'd only be paying 30% on income tax and only up to 12% on CGT. So that's where the endowment shows a real benefit in terms of tax. But the endowment doesn't stop there, right? There's further benefits of an endowment, like creditor protection. In Section 63 of the Long-Term Insurance Act talks about creditor protection being afforded to clients who own an endowment for a period of greater than 3 years based on who your beneficiaries are. But again, we're not going to deep dive into it, but just to let you know that creditor protection is a further benefit of endowment. So is the ability to nominate a beneficiary, because the ability to nominate a beneficiary means I don't pay an executive fee, and that would be a further benefit, right? Having the ability to nominate a beneficiary also enables me to see exactly where the funds will go without it passing through the estate. Now, estate duty will be payable regardless of having the unit trust or the endowment solution, but there's ways and means based on the Estate Duty Act of who you elect to be that eventual beneficiary. And if that's your spouse, I don't really want to start quoting all of these sections, but Section 4Q does apply, where if you leave your spouse as a beneficiary, you actually won't even pay estate duty on it. So I'm saying all of these are considerations and conversations for you to be having with your financial advisor, because based on who you want as a beneficiary based on what your family dynamics are. And going back to your first point about the unique nature of this, the endowment and the investment account have got their place, and it's literally based on what your unique circumstances are.
It sounds like there's so many options to consider. I know investors often talk about liquidity and the liquidity requirements, and I'm sure that will be one of the factors to consider as it relates to what type of vehicle you choose to invest. And certainly one would need to consider the tax consequences. That was really informative. Thank you, Brandon. Moving on a little bit, an investor has now invested offshore. What do they need to consider from a last will and testament perspective? You touched a little bit about beneficiary allocation with endowments, but is there something, bigger that we need to consider? Are there any other implications that we need to consider, certainly as it relates to a last will and testament?
So often when it comes to a last will and testament, you'd find it depends on how you've structured your offshore investing, right? So if I've got an offshore investment account or an offshore unit trust, you tend to have clients who have two wills, a so-called offshore will and a local will.
Oh, wow.
And it's really important that those two wills talk to each other rather than against each other, if you know what I mean. Because then you could get a question of which will came first, which will came second, which takes precedence, and those types of questions become quite important. If you've got an offshore endowment and that's the manner that you've invested offshore, there isn't really a need for an offshore will. It's only if you're holding a direct investment account or property or anything else, any other assets offshore, that the offshore will becomes important to hold alongside your so-called local will. And the reasons for this is offshore, they've got their own jurisdictions, you've got your own regulatory environment in place.
Yes.
And there's various, so as mentioned, that offshore will alongside your local will would really make sense to give you a holistic picture of where your estate is and what implications would be. And on that point of an offshore will, you'd often hear this term of a grant of probate, right? And this refers to, in your offshore jurisdiction, giving permission to the executor to wind up your estate. So a grant of probate will only be applicable if we're talking about a direct investment account or a unit trust, whereas it does not apply if we're talking about an offshore endowment. And further to this, and this might sound as if it's getting messy here, and tax is always messy, right? So it's important that we share this information. It's important for clients and their advisors to have these messy, important conversations about tax. Another concept that comes across quite a bit is the concept of situs, right? The term situs essentially is an estate, how we term it, estate duty in South Africa. You pay a tax on your estate on your passing. Offshore, we call this a situs tax. Essentially, situs means I'll pay tax in the jurisdiction of my investment on my passing. And these amounts or these percentages of tax that you pay vary just depending on the jurisdiction that you're dealing with. And the two popular ones that we know in South Africa and we often deal with would be the UK and the US. So in the UK, the tax rate is 40%, and that's only on amounts that are greater than 325,000 GBP. In the US, it's also 40%, but unfortunately, it's slightly more restrictive here, whereas only your first 60,000 is free of the situs tax, and any amount above that will be taxed. Of course, there's double tax agreements in place, and you won't be paying estate duty here and situs there. So there won't be that type of implication, but it's something to bear in mind if you decide to go the route of having an investment account rather than dealing with an endowment where the grant of probate and situs is not really a concern.
So thank you, Brandon. I think just raising some really valid points as it relates to why investors would require not only sound financial advice, but the right fiduciary partners. And it sounds quite interesting, death and taxes. Never subjects that are not messy and not complex. But I think what's important for investors to understand is that there are fiduciary services available that can help them through this and can help them, demystify a lot of this and make these complex processes a little bit more simple. But there are also financial advisors out there that have access to these ecosystems. Thank you very much. You spoke a little bit about jurisdiction. And in order for an investor to access some kind of vehicle offshore, they need to go through some kind of international jurisdiction. Take me through that concept a little bit and just shed some light on why it's important to choose the right jurisdiction.
Sure. So naturally, when you're dealing with countries offshore, they've got their own laws and regulations that apply there, right? So the regulatory environment of the jurisdiction you decide to invest in is really important. Based on whether you go via the investment account or the endowment, based on that unique jurisdiction would have implications for you. So what we see commonly used in the offshore universe would be the Channel Islands, so Jersey, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, and even Bermuda Island as well. These are often used as offshore jurisdictions because of the regulatory environment is quite strong. But in terms of offshore, these jurisdictions have the reputation, a really strong reputation built up over a number of years, and got a really stable regulatory environment and legal system. And that's the reason you find that they would be the most popular ones used. Now, of course, if you ask this to a man on the street, it's very difficult to know this. And then that's why we always come back to partnering with the financial advisor who can put you in a position where you're able to have this conversation and go into the jurisdiction of choice based on your need.
So whether you're a seasoned investor or just starting out, Liberty has all of the solutions for you to help diversify your investments and grow your wealth. Liberty is invested in it with you, and we are passionate about going global together.